Right, well, so to our first speaker, who many of you will know, Graham White is going to be talking to us on a landscape scale assessment of the Colne Valley's wetlands and their importance to waterbirds. And just a little bit about Graham. Graham is retired head of ecology at RSPB, now a jobbing ecologist helping out here and there. Always interested in wetlands and ducks in particular. He's been grovelling around the Lee and Colne Valleys for 50 years. So thank you, Graham, for coming and speaking to us again. Look forward to your talk, and please welcome Graham.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see some old faces, getting older every year. I'm sure you think the same. Right. Let's put my glasses on. So I'm getting old. See what we're talking about. So I'm going to be. I'm talking about a study that I did for the Wildlife Trust last winter, throughout the whole of last winter, looking at the wetlands throughout the Colne Valley, and this stretched from Rickmansworth down to Denham, as well as looking at the condition of each of those sites, mainly gravel pits. I was doing quite a lot of counting of waterbirds, ducks, etc. And doing that at different times to the standard Webb's counts. So I was going at odd times, looking for movements, going in midweek and adding to what the Webb's counters were doing at that time. So this was what I was tasked to do. First of all, looking at an assessment of the last 10 years of Webb's counts. I'd done a similar study to this 15 years ago, so I was looking back to that previous study in 06, 07 and looking at changes, but looking at the Webb's counts and seeing what we could get out of that for changes in the waterbird populations. Dedicated counts of waterbirds throughout the Colne, as I mentioned, throughout that winter. Ecological evaluation of the importance of the water bodies for waterbirds, and assess if issues such as habitat change, disturbance, etc. have been affecting what we're finding there in the waterbird communities and numbers, and then at the end of that provide some recommendations for habitat management of the different sites. At the same time, the Wildlife Trust was running training courses for some of the angling clubs, which was quite useful. So we had some links with the angling clubs to get into sites and to get some discussions going with those as well. So that's it, and I'm going to give you the results of that. So first of all, let's just look at the overall number of waterbirds that were present last winter compared to the previous study back in 2006-2007. So the orange line at the top is 2006-2007, the blue line below is the numbers. This is the total numbers across all of the sites over that winter. And you've got a standard winter line of waterbirds arriving, reaching a peak and then dropping down in the spring. The winter most of the winters these days of course are relatively mild. Last winter there was one, if you remember, very short, sharp cold spell in December, which you'll see in some of the graphs coming up. It resulted in, for a few days, nearly all of the water bodies frozen over, and did result in some movements of birds, both in and out. But overall, you can see the graph there, and over the years there's a drop. So we've lost 25% of the birds over those times. We'll come and have a look at all of that, what's going on. Two species were very prominent throughout the whole of the winter, shoveler and pochard. And the numbers of those two species were, for the whole of the valley, combined above the level of national significance. I'll come back and show you what those figures are. So that was really good. The valley is important, particularly for those species. Of the birds that were there, coot and tufted duck formed over half of the bulk of the birds. They were the two commonest birds, as you would expect on a lot of these sites. Let's move on, look at some of the different species. Start with shoveler, as that was the key species, if you like. You can see the graph there as the occurrence during the winter, which was rather odd. built up towards the end of the winter and then dropped off in the spring. I suspect their birds were moving from other sites in southwest London and coming into the Colne towards the end of the winter, but also there was probably there some arrival of birds, sort of spring movement if you like, coming to a peak at that time. The peak count was 344 shoveler in February. There were quite a lot of high counts around that time on different sites. The two best sites, and I'll keep coming up with this, Bullwater Lake down in Middlesex and Stockers Lake. Bullwater Lake had the biggest count overall, 232, and most of the birds were on these two sites, although there were a lot of movements, and the birds between these two sites, and same with the next species I'm going to talk about, were moving about. So you might get a big count on one site, and then you cut it down a few days later and the big count on another site. So these birds were moving about quite a lot. The shoveler, they're nearly all roosting during the day. Sometimes they'd be feeding a little bit, but mainly roosting and suspecting they're moving out to feed at night on a whole range of different sites. So shoveler are doing well over there. They're one of the few things in sort of winter and water birds that are increasing at the moment. One of the reasons we'll come down to for declines later on, of course, is climate change. Winters are getting warmer, so a lot of water birds are going down in numbers. And for the same reason, shoveler are going up, because they would formerly have wintered further south, but less of them are going further south, and so we're getting increased numbers here. So that's very important. So that's the shoveler, an interesting distribution pattern. And say very variable in numbers, and there were a number of people doing different counts, and it was quite interesting just to try and keep up with the different counts and where the birds were at different times in the valley. So there was a similar sort of thing for pochard as well. Peak count of 234 in the valley in November. You can see there a sort of more standard winter distribution. The dip in the middle is the very cold frozen bit when they all vanished on the few days that we were counting. But then presumably these just moved off. I guess they moved to sort of bigger unfrozen reservoirs in southwest London, and then came back when the waters opened up. Again, it's a bird that gathers in roost, a bit like the shoveler, roosts and refuge areas during the day and moving out to feed at night. And again, the same two sites, Broadwater and Stockers, were the most important sites. And again, just like with shoveler, you were seeing movements of birds. The big flocks would be on one site one day, on another site, the other site another time, just moving backwards and forwards. So a very similar sort of distribution pattern of these two species. The trend nationally, pochard, very steady, very steep decline over a number of years. The interesting thing about pochard locally, same in the Lee Valley as well, is that although the numbers have declined, they've not declined as much as the national level. So the relative importance of pochard in both Lee and Colne Valleys has gone up. So there is a lower in the numbers, but because the national significance level, at the bottom there, 230, has dropped, the levels of importance locally has come up, which is good. So pochard quite like our grotty gravel pits, and again, it's in Colne Valley, it's quite an important bird. Tufted duck, they're everywhere. Of course, tufted duck, very common, one of the commonest species. You can see the graph again there with the cold weather dip in the middle, building up for winter numbers and then dropping away. Peak count 746, November, Broadwater Lake. Diving bird, feeding particularly on molluscs and things, and spreads out. It's quite tolerant of disturbance, etc., so it spreads out evenly throughout the waters during the day. Not much movement unless you find really heavy disturbance on sites, and the birds will move to the quieter refuge areas. And again, the same sites would have been popular: Broadwater, Stockers Lake. One of the interesting things about tufted duck is in the previous study there was quite a big molt gathering of tufted duck at Broadwater Lake, 700 plus birds, and a lot of these sites haven't been very well recorded over the years, so there's big gaps. But we were quite interested in looking at that molt gathering in particular. So this is where the birds lose their flight feathers, I'm sure you know, and looking at peak counts in August time. And Broadwater Lake was a good molting site, but numbers have dropped right off. There was about, I think, 360, I think, molting birds that we found, and a few, quite a lot of birds gather to molt on Broadwater Lake, which is quite interesting. We'll come back to that later on. But in the figures, those birds were largely missing, which was an interesting thing to look at as well. Tufted ducks, the trend nationally is very slight decline. We're seeing a similar sort of decline locally, but a lot of the birds that we've got are local breeders, UK breeders, and we're probably getting slightly less coming from abroad because of the climate changes that we're seeing, which we'll come back to later on. Gadwall. So the pattern of, you can see, look at the graph there, the pattern of gadwall in the Colne Valley. Low numbers to start with, big drop off from when the previous study in 6-7. What there was is, in contrast to the last couple of graphs, there was a big arrival in that cold spell on a couple of the lakes. The key lakes here were rather different. Hinesfield and the Troy Lakes were the key sites that had the wintering birds on. There was a big arrival at that time, along with widgeon in that very cold spell, and then they quickly dispersed as well, so quite a different pattern. Gadwall, of course, are feeding on aquatic weeds. Aquatic plants are in the gravel pits, and the best sites were Pinesfield and Troy, where there were also good numbers of coot, which they associate with, and those were the best weedy sites in the valley at that time. We'll come back and talk about weeds again later on. But overall, in the Colne, a big decline in gadwall over the years as conditions have deteriorated. And again, the UK trend has been a big increase over the years, levelling out now, and so the level of national significance has risen, which means relatively the Colne Valley is of less importance. And the same for the next one, of which there are tiny, tiny numbers now, and the numbers that we get locally in terms of national significance is absolutely tiny. National significance level 4,300 for teal. Of course, we only get very, very small numbers, and in the Colne here you can see the peak was 22 birds. I'll put it in though because it is interesting. It's the species that's very typical of shallow, muddy, newer waters, if you like, and the decline is reflecting the loss of that sort of habitat. By far the best site is Maple Lodge Nature Reserve, which has got nice open, shallow waters. The numbers at the beginning of the season were incredibly low because the site, when we started doing the counts, the site was dry after a drought. A lot of the water levels at the beginning of the season were very low on the lakes, but Maple Lodge in particular, it was dry, so it took a while for the numbers of teal to build up. Yeah, so that's an interesting one which reflects the loss of that habitat. We're seeing similar sorts of things in the Lee Valley as well. Okay, we'll come on and have a look at Cormorant Grey Heron, a couple of ones that I'm particularly interested in and quite interesting to look at. So these two birds, the counts I'm doing here, they're not so much the wintering counts. I was looking at the breeding birds in the spring. And there's two places where both of them nest in the Colne Valley, and we're talking Stockers Lake and Broadwater Lake again. Start off with cormorants at the top. There's a bit of a messy graph there. The orange line right at the bottom is the numbers at Stockers Lake, which is very small, under 10, you can see all the way through there. The main colony is at Broadwater Lake, which is the blue. It's a bit, figures in some years are missing, so it's not counted every year. The yellow line is the trend, and if you look at that, the trend over the last 10 years or so decline and then stabilising perhaps. So they're not doing brilliantly, the cormorants. And that's quite interesting because that's against the national trend of inland cormorants. So why is that happening? And we're sort of looking at that and trying to work out what's going on with cormorants. And actually in the Colne Valley there's a very similar trend against the national trend of inland cormorants. So the colonies look all right. Cormorants, of course, rather not very helpful in they destroy their own colonies. You can see the picture there, the trees covered in guano which die away. But in these areas there's plenty of trees, no shortage of trees. I spent quite a bit of time looking at the number of young they were producing. And in general they were producing over 2 young per nest on average. So up to, if not better than the national average. So, okay, so their productivity is good, so I'm guessing that food is okay, they've got enough food coming in, so something else is going on in those areas on cormorants. Jump down to heron. So, heron, same 2 colonies. On there you've got the blue bars is Broadwater, and the bigger colony is up at Stockers. And again, the trend over the periods is a slow decline on both of those sites. And again, that's actually very similar to the Colne Valley. This year, luckily, they seem to have gone up slightly. Now that is with the national trend. That's very similar to the national trend. So where there has been an increase and then slowly dropping down in recent years. So that's pretty good. Well, it's not that good, they're declining, but at least it's on trend, if you like, and there's not something unusual going on in the Colne Valley. Right, moving on. What else is there? Other species that we could touch on briefly. Red-crested pochard. The Colne Valley's famous for its lovely red-crested pochards. I'm sure you're aware that red-crested pochards are showing a sort of steady but slow increase in our area, in both the Colne and the Lee, but the Colne is the big place. I got up to 30 odd birds, mainly on Stockers Lake and Berry Lake, but they're quite mobile. And I was finding flocks moving up and down the valley. The numbers last year were quite low compared with a couple of previous years, only about half the amount, and numbers have been going up each year, and they are beginning to breed as well. Breeding records are coming, particularly from places like Maple Lodge. So they're slowly establishing themselves in the area. Great crested grebe, up in the top left side, is quite an interesting one. In the past, there were quite large winter numbers, and they particularly came in early in the winter, and there was a molt gathering on Broadwater, and that seems to have disappeared again. And the numbers during the winter of great crested grebes in the Colne Valley seem to really closely mirror the total breeding population. So in the spring, I was going around counting up how many were breeding on all the sites, and the total wintering population is probably just that. At the beginning, it was the breeding population plus the young of the year plus a few coming in from local areas, but not much more. So with great crested grebe, we've got a good number locally, but it seems to have lost birds coming in for the winter, as in other areas, or at least in the Colne. And then we've got a couple of really typical winter visitors, and I might throw goldeneye in here as well. So smew, goosander, goldeneye, all were quite, 15 years ago, all were quite typical wintering birds in the Colne, and they've all but gone. There's more goldeneye than the others. I think I've got up to 15 goldeneye. There was one Drake smew last winter, moving around different sites in the Colne. That was quite interesting, tracking it, moving it up and down the valley. Goosander got up to just 1 or 2 birds. So these birds are virtually lost. They're becoming scarcer and scarcer each year. Same with the Lee. Numbers have dropped right off. You know, from my experience in the Lee, you know, if you go back to the 80s, I was watching flocks of 100 goosander and 40 spew. And now of course, you know, there's what we've got in the Lee Valley. We've got about 3 spew this winter. So numbers have plummeted. We'll come back to why on that as well in a minute. Okay, so some sort of total counts of the waterbirds during the valley, and focus mainly on the red and get very depressed. So you can look at the count between 2006-7 and 2022-23. Great Christy Grebe declining sharply, Coleman declining, Mute Swan declining, Canada Goose, back same, hurrah.
Oh, sorry, I'm going around, sorry.
Yeah, 22's on the left. Grey Lag Goose, increasing, hooray. Hooray. Ish. Widgeon and Gadwall, well, Widgeon doesn't look much lower, but it is a bit lower. But that 107, there was a sharp influx in that cold weather where birds came in and then disappeared. Gadwall down, Teal down, Mallard down, Shoveler up, hooray. Pochard, Red Crested Pochard up. And you can see it's a general decline. If you look at, again, Goldeneye, back in 6-7, 72 Goldeneye was the peak in the valley, 15. Smew from 8 down to 1. Goosander, 23 down to 2. So big drop-offs. Coot, a decline, not as dramatic as some of the others, but going down. So pretty depressing, if you like, across the board. These are the different sites, the total numbers of birds on the sites through the months, and again, focus maybe on the red bit and look at the peak counts on those sites. Big drop-offs at Stockers and Broadwater, but those are the 2 most important sites by far, which have the biggest numbers. Some sites in the middle of the valley were holding numbers, or even slightly better. So Pinesfield had quite good numbers, Troy Lakes had quite good numbers. But certainly last winter they had quite a lot of coot and gadwall feeding on the aquatic weeds there, which has boosted those numbers. But in general, sites are dropping off. Let's just look at the important sites. Start off with Broadwater, which is the triple SI in the valley, and it is the most important site for waterbirds. It's got the highest numbers of shoveler pochard, tufted ducks. It was supporting around 800 ducks at peak. And it's a breeding site for cormorants and grey herons on the islands there. And the critical thing about Broadwater is it's a refuge, and birds, as I mentioned earlier, will come in there, and the pochard and the shoveler will roost on there during the day in flocks, and then presumably move out, and they'd certainly move out from there in the valley. So it's a really important site, and without knowing exactly where these birds are going, you know, this site is supporting birds not only on that site, but throughout the valley, and probably wider in southwest London. So, as you probably know, a proposal to put a water sports facility on that lake, to me, was appalling. The site, it already has water sports on there, but it's got a very big refuge area. But the new proposal was to build the new centre within the existing refuge, and to shrink the refuge down to a tiny area, which, if you look at disturbance distances, was clearly not feasible. So to put it on this site, a triple SI, and within the refuge, it's just, you know, the damage would be way beyond this site. It would be impacting on the valley and probably wider. So we don't know the outcome of that yet. There's been a lot of objections, hopefully some of yours, but we'll wait and see. But to build it put it on this site is absolutely terrible, I think. Stockers Lake, luckily, is a nature reserve and is a very important site. The numbers between Broadwater and Stockers sort of move backwards and forwards as well. So they're both very important. We've got very similar species, and again, you've got breeding cormorants and grey herons and little egrets tucked in there, as well as terns and black-headed gulls on the rafts. And again, it functions as a refuge. So when birds get disturbed on other sites, they pile into Stockers. Things have changed there, though. When was I going to talk about coot? I can't remember. I'll mention coot now. So one of the things that's happened on coot, the numbers have dropped slightly, but the distribution of those birds has changed dramatically. So there's certain sites that have a lot of coot, and there's other sites where the numbers have virtually vanished. Now, coot is a species that reflects very closely the amount of food within that water, and they're tolerant, and they'll stay on that water till they eat out the food, and then they'll move on. So if you're finding a site that hasn't got many coot on at the beginning of winter, you can pretty strongly guess that there isn't much food in there. Whereas if you've got another site that's covered in coot, it's almost certainly going to have submerged aquatic plants for it to feed on. So in the Colne, Berry Lake remains really good, loads of coot on there. Stockers Lake, the numbers of coot have disappeared. And the same with Broadwater as it happens. So both of those lakes seem to have lost their submerged aquatic plants for some reason. We'll come back to that. So Stockers Lake, second most important site. Well, when I say second, it's one of the two most important sites, the second mentioned. And then the other site, which is very different, but I think equally important, is Maple Lodge Nature Reserve. Now this is a small site, and it has relatively small numbers of birds, but it's got different species. It's the only place that's really got shallow lagoons, and this is where you will find teal, you'll find gadwall there in summer, molting in good numbers, breeding birds. So as a contrast to the other sites, it's really important to maintain that. And again, it is a refuge site, so you can see birds going in there when other sites are highly disturbed. So it's a great site, key refuge, and it's actually got a good volunteer team on there doing management work. So, patterns of distribution of these birds, and this will be fairly familiar to you. So you've got tolerant birds, mute swans, coots, which sit around on their favoured lakes where there's food, and they'll stay there, and they won't worry too much about whatever sort of disturbance is going on. Many species will move when disturbance gets to a level, and they'll move into the refuges, which we mentioned. Some of those will stay in there and fly out at night. And then you'll get other species, particularly things like goldeneye, which will disperse during the day and then gather in the evening to form roosts. Both Broadwater and Stockers function a bit like that. Your best counts of those are going to be in the evening. But the key things on this is all these sites are important. All of them are providing food for the birds of the Colne Valley. All right, you may go and look at a site that's heavily disturbed by day and see not many water birds on it. But if you went first thing in the morning or you were there at night, you'd probably find a lot of birds coming in and feed. So they're supporting the whole collection of birds throughout the valley. Trends then, what's happening? Well, as I've already mentioned, most things are going down. The only things which seem to be done better in the comparison of those 2 years anyway, and the longer term trends. Shoveler we mentioned, red-crested potcher, grey-necked goose, hooray. And then most things on either a fast or a slower declining trend. So what's going on? Four big topics that I pulled out, which are implicated here. Now, first of all, we will all know climate change. So milder winters, many of these wintering waterbirds are short stopping. There's less, less coming from the continent, and I'm just going to run over here and get my water. Thank you. So there's less coming from the continent, so we're expecting that. So, okay, you know, we understand that. The one that's going against that trend is shoveler, where we're getting more because of climate change. Is there anything we can do about that? We'll come and look at these different issues after this. Second, natural succession. Gravel pits, they mature incredibly quickly. And if you look at these pits now, they're ringed with trees. A lot of the marginal vegetation has gone, and you get successional issues going on within the water itself. And we're losing open banks, and we're losing shallow water areas. So that's number two, a big one. Number three, declining food resource, and particularly coming back and looking at weed here, aquatic plants within these places. And one of the things that you keep looking at is the impact of fish populations and invasive non-native species. And we'll come back and look at that and get a little bit annoyed. And also perhaps water quality as well. And for example, in the Colne Valley, in the last 2 winters, I've seen quick and fast declines of coot on some water after we get these bursts of heavy rainfall and surge of turbid, foamy water coming down. And my website, last 2 years after it's been inundated like that, I've seen immediate drop-offs of coot and things, which is not good. So water quality, again, you know, all of these things are coming in. And then fourthly, conflict with humans. We'll come back and have a look at what that might be. Okay, climate change, mentioned it really. Here's a nice picture from back in the 80s when it was lovely and cold. I don't really mean that, I hate the cold now. But right, we know that situations have changed considerably, and we know that it's a strong contributing factor to the lower numbers of quite a few of these species. Gravel pit ecology. So, typical view of a sort of a gravel pit in the Colne Valley now. Trees have grown up massively since these sites were excavated, and the ecology has changed within the water. The nutrient levels increase, the fish populations change, and you get this ongoing change within the lakes, which reduce in many cases the amount of food for waterbirds. So it's a tricky one, and it's exactly the same in the Lee and the Colne Valley. So here's some pictures. These are from the Lee Valley pictures, natural succession. So the top 3 pictures is chestnut gravel pits. Over the years, moving through, it's I remember it being an arable field, and now it's virtually a woodland. And then the lower 3 pictures is Amwell, where it's been dug out in the 70s, and you've got through to the current situation, which at least Amwell is one of the sites where it is managed, and the edges are being kept open, so there's quite a lot of reed and stuff around the edge. So the impact there is less. But we're seeing these changes on gravel pits are going to be typical. So here's some shots from the Colne. On the left, there's an aerial picture which I saw yesterday on Twitter, which I pinched. But I thought it was quite interesting. It's a big lake, but you can see it's completely ringed by trees all the way around. It's an important site for birds. As I mentioned, there were large numbers of coots on there, gadwall, so there's obviously quite a lot of aquatic plants. There's a good little cormorant roost during the day in there, and numbers of things like tufted duck are good, and you also, birds from here flip over from broadwater, so goosander, etc. Goldeneye, what's left of them, will flip onto here to feed. But it's got a lot of trees around the edge. And then you've got other lakes, like Denham Lakes down the bottom right here, which are completely ringed with trees. You've actually got nice habitat. It's wet woodland habitat now, which is very good for a lot of other things, of course. But it's changing what's there for waterbirds. And then up on the top right, you've got that was Leinster's. It's a private angling club. Difficult to get in there. Always catch the back of your trousers when you're going over the barbed wire. Oh, I'm joking. They let me in this time. And to be fair, they are managing pretty well in there as well. They're doing good stuff for waterfowl, and they're managing some of the margins very well. So that's very good news as well. So sites are changing dramatically. Weeds. So typically you'll find where you've got very young gravel pits, you'll find a mass of aquatic plants. This is Nuttall's pondweed, which is very common in these and gets fed on by coot and gadwall in these flocks. But this has declined quite a lot in these sites. So partly you've got successional changes within these, the nutrient levels within the waters increase, and it may not be so favourable for the species, but there's other things going on as well. So if you look at actually both the Lee and the Colne, there's a lot of angling clubs, very nice, but they do like to introduce things like carp. And what do we know about carp? There's loads of studies that show they don't get on with waterbirds very well. So one study found 100 kilograms per hectare of carp reduced aquatic plants and waterbirds by 50%. Now, just to put a bit of context on that, on nature reserves where we're managing for bitterns, we have a target level of fish of 10 kilograms per hectare, right? And that's enough to keep fish-eating birds going. If you look up recommended densities of carp on angling lakes, they recommend 1,000 kilograms per hectare. So it's quite a bit of difference. Now, most of those will be big fish, of course. And you know, a lot of what birds are wanting are small fish, but there's an impact going on there. And not only are these lovely carp feeding on invertebrates, but they're churning up the bottom and reducing weed and making some of the waters quite turbid. So that's a potential, right? That's one potential. And the other one, which has increasingly come to my notice, is crayfish. Pardon?
Just giving you a time check.
Oh, crikey, wait a minute, 5 minutes. Right, I'll rush up. So crayfish, loads of these things in gravel pits now. If anyone saw the Great Northern Dive at Stansted Abbotts gravel pits, just watching it, bringing up crayfish after crayfish after crayfish, unbelievable. This guy, Tony Booker, is a fisherman who's done brilliant work on the impact of crayfish, and they're putting sediment into the water, and they are a big problem. And some of these lakes in the Colne have huge numbers. Conflict with human activity. Water sports to start with. On Broadwater, although there's a massive refuge, I think that my view is that the molting numbers have probably declined because of disturbance of the water sports. They may keep out of the refuge area mainly, but every now and again you see the safety motorboat whizzing around all over the place. So it's only got to do that at the wrong time to cause an impact. Cormorant, why are cormorants going down? Fishing clubs, interestingly, have licences to shoot cormorants. I'm currently asking Natural England how many and what numbers, but what I do know is that one club in the Colne Valley each year shoots 50 cormorants, which is roughly the productivity of cormorants in the Colne Valley. So, just guessing, is that the reason that they're not doing very well? Right, just to finish up, what are we going to do? So, climate change, can we do anything about it? Well, there's lots, you know, there's big debate, but locally, on those waters, probably the most important thing is to manage them as well as we can. And and the key thing is structural diversity in vegetation, as much diversity in the vegetation as possible, so that you're providing for a great range of species. So management of those areas, early successional habitats, all very important. And of course, the other key things all the time, good biosecurity to slow the spread of invasives and manage pollutions, which are already causing problems. And look what's coming. So, you know, I've been all bad news. These water bodies are going to be, the important ones are going to be important in the future, but for different species. So it's important to keep managing them. Right, final slide. What are the actions? Essential that we maintain the key refuge areas because they're supporting all the other sites. Broadwater, Stockers Lake, Maple Lodge. Maintain early successional habitats. Get out there and chop those willows down. We want marginal vegetation, diverse marginal vegetation where we can. Not all of them, you know, some trees are good, but where we're losing the stuff, keep it there. Reduction of tree cover to enhance marginal vegetation, said all that. Maintain natural fish populations on key sites if we can. Not always easy. Reduction of signal crayfish if we can. Again, Tony Booker's doing some good experiments on certain lakes at looking at reducing them. Not easy. And ideally, and this was working with the angling clubs, and some of them are doing really good stuff, putting management plans in place to actually do a lot of these actions. And that's it. Thank you. So, certainly thanks to the Webb's counters in the area over the year, particularly Paul Lewis, really helpful. Tony Booker, brilliant with his crayfish stuff. Heritage Lottery's done funding for this study commissioned by Colne Valley Regional Park and the Wildlife Trust. Thank you for that. No questions, good.
I've only got time for one question. Has anyone got a question for Graham?
Always do it tight, so you can't questions.
We don't have to have a question. I did wonder, Graham, myself, that, can't see any hands, I'll get a question. Has there been any changes in birds like scaup that turn up, or do they just remain rare and...
they just remain rare. You always, there's always when if you're doing the webs, you're always hoping for something exciting, slightly different, and occasionally things do turn up, but there's no pattern, no real pattern that we've seen that. And of course, well, if anything, there is a pattern, and that's again climate change. When I look back at the old days in the 80s when we had lovely cold weather, you would get a lot more. I used to, on very cold days, I would go out and look for what I would call a set of divers and a set of grebes, which was 3 different divers, 5 grebe species in a day, which in the Lee Valley I probably could do. Yeah. But you don't get many of those days these days.
No. Yes. Well, it's quite sort of close to my heart too, because I spend a lot of time at gravel pits, as you'll find out later. And the same problem faces all the gravel pits around St Albans too, really.
May I just say very quickly, fantastic photograph.
It's amazing, isn't it?
I just wonder who won the battle between the one flying in that and another.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I would guess the fish lost.
Yeah. But I put that picture in, I did this talk before to the angling clubs, and I put that in particularly to provoke a little bit of discussion. Which it did. Which I have to say was very positive. Don't get me wrong.
Fantastic
It was a good discussion.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you very much. Oh, one question at the back.
Quick question. HS2.
Oh, yes.
You probably haven't got much time.
Well, in a way, the answer to that is the proposal for sailing club on Broadwater, which is linked to HS2. They're doing this to improve it for wildlife. Would you believe? There is another lake. Well, there's several lakes actually where the flyovers go right across. Yeah. So a couple of smaller lakes, Colne Lake is sort of lost. Harefield number 2 was in this study where the flyover goes right across. That never had many duck on it and may not have changed much. So it was still being built during this study, so I can't finally say what the impacts will be.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Graham.